Heyo, OmniDogs and OmniKittens. It's OmniDog from OmniDog's Vault here with a special interview with my co-host Taylor Brown. Taylor, how's it going?
I'm doing great, and we're really honored to have Cullen Bunn with us today. Cullen, how are you doing?
I'm doing great. How are you guys?
We're doing great, and we're really happy that you're able to join us today. We really appreciate you taking the time aside to talk to us.
Yeah, I'm happy to be here.
We have a list of questions that I'm immediately ignoring because I want to ask you. I saw your video on your collection, and as far as I can tell, you're the only one with a Forrest J. Ackerman statue.
Oh yeah, it's right up there. It watches over me every day. So,
and he must have been a huge influence on you, because I know what a huge influence he was just in science fiction and horror in general.
Yeah.
And to have a statue of him, I mean, that's committing.
Yeah. No.
You can see I got statues behind me, but they're of all female characters that I don't know anything about. But Forrest J. Ackerman was a real person and helped shape the industry, really, didn't he?
Yeah, I mean, he was a huge fan of books and movies and comics, and he was the founder of Famous Monsters of Filmland magazine. Which, if you were to, I don't pan this camera around because my office is the mess is strategically positioned so you can't see it. But over here in this corner, you'd see I have a huge collection of a huge spinner rack full of Famous Monsters of Filmland, because that magazine was so important to me when I was growing up. I mean, I loved that magazine so much, and it really informed my in a big way, my love of horror, my love of writing, and my love of collecting, because the Forrest Ackerman had what they call the Acker Mansion, which was just full of his collection, which would basically a giant museum of fandom. And I don't know that we have anything like that in existence anymore, except Guillermo del Toro's Bleak House is the same kind of just this testimony to fandom and horror movies and monsters, and that's he was the ultimate collector and just the ultimate fan. So yeah, I have the statue over here. When I saw that, I was in a comic shop somewhere and saw that on the shelf, and immediately knew I had to have it. So.
I think it's a real testament to how he was aware of how he was aware of what he was doing in reaching out to fandom. The fact that Famous Monsters of Filmland, you would have thought that would have been like a niche kind of small thing, but that magazine existed for at least 30 years, right?
Yeah, no, it absolutely went beyond what you'd think was the die-hard horror movie fan. And it was on the shelf of every drugstore you go in, you find a Famous Monster magazine. And I always had one around. And I had a couple of cousins who were a little older than me, and we used to visit them, and they were both super fans of of science fiction and horror and monsters and comics. And one of them was a really talented artist and was making masks. And I remember I'd go to their house, and I was just always amazed because their room was just decorated with these masks that they'd made, these full head masks. And they always had the huge collection of Famous Monsters and comics everywhere. And I think they introduced me to Famous Monsters magazine. But as soon as I saw it in there, I read a few issues at their place. I was in for the long haul. And I didn't get back into collecting them until relatively recently. But there was an issue when I was a kid that I read at my cousin's house that they were speculating about The Empire Strikes Back. What was The Empire Strikes Back going to be? Wow. And they had done a contest where people could take their action figures and set up dioramas of their action figures from Star Wars and set up scenes that they would think might happen in The Empire Strikes Back. And a few years back, that memory of that issue just popped into my head, and I had to have it again. I had to track it down because I thought maybe I dreamed it. And finally, I found it. And as soon as I found that, I was like, "Oh, I'm back into collecting this magazine because it was awesome."
Yeah, Jess and I both watched your collection video. Obviously, you collect comics, statues, magazines. Like, what are some of your prized possessions in your office?
Oh, it's tough.
I saw you had a copy of Creepy #1.
Yeah, I have a lot of the old Warren magazines. And and I don't really I don't have issues that I'm precious about so much. I mean, I read that issue of Creepy. And I have a Famous Monsters #1 somewhere over here that's important to me. But it's all connected to memories and things that I loved. I love this old spinner rack that I've got back here because it's an old original spinner rack that was in the grocery store. And I like these some of these action figures. They're not worth anything, but they were important to me as a kid. There's a ceramic Darth Vader up here that my sister painted for me when I was I was very young. So that's probably one of my more prized items. And somewhere over here, I've got an issue of Magneto #1 that Stan Lee signed for me and told me to keep up the good work.
Cool.
So that's a big one for me is having that. And I keep it. Usually it's in here. Sometimes it's out in the hall, but it's things like that. It's just I don't necessarily have any one thing that I really collect. I just most of my collection is keyed towards memories and nostalgia.
What I liked about your spinner rack, I have a spinner rack too, and it squeaks the exact same way yours does. I love
it's a rickety old spinner rack, but I'm proud of that thing. It's got rust around the bottom, and it's the wires are bent in places in weird shapes, but so it was much used and much loved.
Yeah, I love mine. It was probably the best birthday gift I ever got from my wife.
Yeah, I can't. I got mine off of off of Craigslist, states and states away. I was one day just speculating about how I loved those old spinner racks, and someone pointed me to it, and I had to track down the user, and they didn't want to sell it over across state lines and ship it and everything, but I managed to get it, and then I had to go by myself to the bus station in St. Louis to pick it up, and it was a little bit of an ordeal to get it, but that just makes it more special, I guess.
Exactly.
Well, it's very obvious to all of our audience that you're a true fan. Willing to go states and states to get a spinner rack. That's awesome.
Yeah, no, my fandom as well. I mean, I'm definitely a longtime real fan of this nonsense.
Well, what were some of your other really important influences as a kid? I know you talked about Ackerman and some other things. What are some other influences, writers or anything, movies that really influenced you to want to be a writer?
I was always a fan of there's so many, I would say, the Godzilla movies were a big deal for me. Anything with a giant monster in it when I was a kid was a huge influence. One of the first things I remember vividly, and this was pre-kindergarten, drawing like a book called Attack of the Monsters, and where all the monsters were attacking humanity, and then humanity had to rally and defeat them. And in the book, I remember that they fly a helicopter over Godzilla's head and drop a sword out of the helicopter, and that killed Godzilla in my Attack of the Monsters. So monsters were, giant monsters were probably the first thing I wanted to tell stories about then. But my dad was a big storyteller. He loved telling, tall tales. So that was an influence. And then when I started getting into comics in a big way, the writer Bill Mantlo was such a huge influence for me. His stories just blew me away. The world building he did on books. He wrote, Micronauts in particular, which is a book based on a toy line, and he created just universes and universes off of a ridiculous little toy line. And that was the first comic I really remember, latching on to that part of the story and latching on to, and Mantlo was the first writer that I really remember looking for books he had written. But yeah, magazines, books, I read a lot of fiction. I was big into fantasy, Tolkien, and when I was a kid, and I still love that stuff. So all of that was, I sometimes at some point I started gravitating more towards horror fiction, but fantasy was my bread and butter. Dungeons and Dragons was a huge influence for me because I played so much of it as a kid, and that all leans into storytelling and creating stories.
Did you like being the dungeon master then? Because you can.
Oh yeah, I'm too much of a control freak to play. I have to be the dungeon master. I don't have to be, but I prefer to be the dungeon master.
Well, you're the writer, so people probably defer to you and just have you be the dungeon master because it makes sense.
Well, everybody wants to direct. That's what they say.
I'm not sure where to start. I know there's two main books that I want to talk about. Taylor just got done with Harrow County, which I loved myself. I have the library editions of, and I spent Friday and Saturday reading. They're under my other Cullen Bunn books. Gunslinger editions, and then I did a video review of it that's coming out Friday. Let me just ask you about Sixth Gun, since that's freshest in my mind, and then we can tackle Harrow County. There is, talk about world building. There is a huge world in these books. Every single book, I mean, there's 6 books. Every single one of them seems to have its own world. And it has the main thing that I like in a book, and that is characters you care about. Because if you lose a character in the book, you care about that. And I'm not going to say anything to spoil it for anybody that hasn't read it yet, but you do such a good job of fleshing out each character that comes in contact with Becky and Drake. If in fact a character moves on to something different, you feel it. You actually feel it, which I think is a great accomplishment.
Well, thank you. Yeah, that book means a lot to me. And it's tough when Brian Hurt, the artist on that book, and I get together, and we've collaborated on a few things. We can't help but just go off on all these tangents and build, trying to add worlds to it and stories and different elements and explore different corners. And there's probably, if we hadn't ended that series when we did, we could still be telling stories of those characters in that world, because we just have notebooks and notebooks full of ideas for where that story was going. And yeah, the characters were a big part of that. And we started the book off intentionally. We wanted the characters to fit into certain tropes. And so you've got, the dark, mysterious gunslinger and the innocent farmer's daughter. And we wanted to start with those stereotypes and tropes, and then turn them into something more than that, and change where you think those characters are going. But we also wanted to make sure that everybody knew that no character is really safe. And the character I love most in that series is the character I was the most cruel to, which is Bill John O'Henry. From the very beginning, is my favorite character, and I was terrible to Bill John.
You were,
and all the characters kind of go through some, they don't have an easy life, but yeah, it started off, we wanted to tell just sort of a rip-roaring fantasy adventure in the Old West, and then we just kept building on it and turning it into, to something something more. Yeah, we could easily be telling more stories of those characters, but we felt like it was important to have an ending. We had the ending of the series in mind pretty much after the first few issues were written, and we knew it was going to be an ongoing series. We knew exactly where it was going to end, and we were lucky enough. You know, you're not always lucky with creator-owned books to be able to do. Well, you're not lucky with any book, but with creator-owned books in particular, you're not always lucky enough to tell the story you want to tell and do everything you want to do. But we were with that book.
And I noticed, I believe it was book 6, that Brian Hurt actually wrote a story.
He did, yeah. You know, we were always involved in kind of coming up with the different concepts, and we'd sit together and brainstorm these ideas together, and then I would just run off and I'd write my scripts and try to surprise Brian in some way with the scripts. But he's a storyteller himself. He loves telling stories. So yeah, he wrote some of the. We co-wrote some of the stuff, some of the spin-off series stuff. We did several mini series that kind of tell stories that predate the main book. And Brian co-wrote some of those and then wrote some of them, you know, completely. And we've, and since that time, we've co-written a few things together.
So you have to have a fair amount of trust in somebody, I would think, to let them. Well, I guess it sounds like you consider him a co-creator of the book, but I would think you'd need to have, since you've been writing it for so long, you need to have a fair amount of trust in somebody to let them go ahead and write your characters.
Well, yeah, and you know, I never felt with those that they were always our characters.
Okay.
It was always Brian and I came up with those characters. Now, it's different. Like, you know, we did a book together previously called The Damned. And in that book, Brian even came to me before we put the book together and said, here's some characters I drew. What do you think? With Six Gun, I actually took that book out, that proposal out without Brian. He wasn't attached to it initially. And he only became involved after the publisher, you know, accepted it. And we started talking about different artists we could work with. But once he became involved, having worked with him before, and I just knew we were going to, you know, build something bigger. There were certain characters that were already in existence. Drake and Becky and the General were already there. They were baked into it. But when Brian became involved, we kind of expanded it, introduced new characters together. We talked a lot about the types of things he wanted to draw, the types of characters he, you know, the types of stories he wanted to illustrate. And yeah, there's always trust. I feel like with every book, no matter what, there has to be that trust between the different collaborators if you want the very best product, you know.
And he co-wrote Man or Black with you, right?
Yeah. So he co-wrote the first arc of Man or Black. I don't know if we're supposed to talk, but he's drawing the second arc of Man or Black, and I'm writing that by myself, and then he's drawing it. But we'll go back and forth with that one. Sometimes he will, you know, as long as I'm working in comics, my hope is that I'll always have a project with Brian in the works, because we've known each other for so long, and we've, you know, I mean, we worked at a comic book store together.
Oh,
yeah, that's how we met, was working at a comic shop.
Cool.
And you know, we talked for years and years about doing a comic together. So you know, I've known him for a long time, and I value his creative influences and his, you know, what he brings to the table. And I've been very lucky to work with him as a collaborator, for sure.
And then you and Tyler Crook have worked together for a decent amount of time. And
yeah,
I just finished Harrow County last night, and it was awesome. And I have to say, this is one of the nicest books I have in my collection. I think it's even nicer than all the other library editions I have. Just the book is so soft, I want to sleep on it. It's so nice. Did you have a lot of input into this library edition line, or?
Well, they kept us really involved with it. And look, I'm not an artist or a designer, so we worked with, I'm sure Tyler had more input, and Keith Wood, who did the design on that book, also did most of the design on the Six Gun stuff. He's a designer that I've worked with for years and years. And yeah, I agree. I think those books are gorgeous. I think they are some of the best library editions and such a great value for what you're getting with those books. And it's a great way to read the series. But yeah, I mean, I had my input on the design, but I definitely leave that, the people who really did the heavy lifting on that were Tyler and Keith and the editorial.
Well, what can you tell us about the new follow-up series you're currently putting out, Tales from Harrow County?
Yeah, so like the Six Gun, Harrow County, we had an idea of what we wanted to do, and we were able to tell the story we wanted to tell in the number of issues, and we brought that story to a close. But we decided there was more story to be told. There's more to do with some of the characters. So even though that first series ended and it tells a complete story, Tales from Harrow County takes place about 10 years after the first series, and follows a character who was a supporting character in the original series named Bernice. And Bernice has become sort of this shepherd of Harrow County, and she's dealing with different supernatural threats and occurrences. So it's very much, has similar vibe to Harrow County. There's a lot of creepiness. There's a lot of heart. There's a lot of fun. I think of it more as a Harrow County. I've always considered sort of a dark fairy tale more than a straight horror book. So that's the vibe I wanted to keep with Tales from Harrow County. And the idea is it's going to be a continuing series of miniseries. It's just so we've told that there was a first 4-issue miniseries, and it definitely leaves some things open, and we're working on the next miniseries as we speak.
It'll be similar to the publication model for Hellboy.
Yeah, it's very much that's how we kind of, I always think of it as sort of the BPRD model, where you've got this series of miniseries. But yeah, that's the way we will tackle Tales from Harrow County. And my guess is, and I don't know for sure, but my guess is they'll put the Tales from Harrow County in those library editions as well.
Ooh, that's awesome. And if you want to be really amazed by how awesome Tyler Crook is, go on YouTube and look up him a time-lapse video of him making these pages. It's crazy. He does everything: the pencils, the inks, the watercolors. It's phenomenal.
Yeah, he's a real talented guy. And here's something that'll blow your mind if you don't know it. There's creepy music playing behind him drawing. He composed all that. That's all his music he created. He did a soundtrack to Harrow County that I think it's out there for free to download. But he did a soundtrack to Harrow County, so he's a multi-talented guy.
Oh, I want to hear that.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure you can find it pretty easily out there. If you just search Harrow County soundtrack Tyler Crook, you'll find it.
Okay, cool.
It's not fair that one guy is so talented.
I know, it irritates me. I get very angry about it. And it would be easier if he was a jerk, but he's also one of the nicest people you'll ever meet. So it's
one of those guys.
It's doubly irritating.
One question I had: you have worked with an awful lot of let's see, Boom and Oni Press, and there also I'd be remiss if I didn't mention your Magneto run for Marvel, which gets universal praise from everybody that I've ever talked to. This was I wasn't aware of it, maybe, I don't know, a couple of years ago, and somebody told me about it, and I read it, and it really is remarkable. What is it like? And I know you had a stint on X-Men for a little bit. What's it like? And you did Sinestro. I always mess up his name. What are the differences, good and bad, between the big two and your own smaller works?
Well, it's I mean, it's vastly different. It's the way I usually describe it. I've said this before in other places. I've always loved Marvel comic. I was a Marvel kid growing up, and X-Men was always a huge. I mean, that was a big comic for me. Doing something with X-Men was always a dream. And I loved a lot of the DC characters, but writing for those companies, it's like you go to a friend's house when you're a kid, and they have the best toys. They have all the best toys, all the toys you love, and you can go and you can play with those toys. But your friend has final say on what you can do with those toys and what adventures you can put them through. And also, when you leave his house, you have to put them back on the shelf in exactly the same condition that they were when you took them down. That's
You're like Jerry on Seinfeld when he roofies his girlfriend so he can play with her toys.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's very much you have to, I mean, they're their characters. They may have plans for those characters that don't involve you. There may be other things going on with those characters. They may have plans for those characters that are years down the line, but you have to keep those in mind that this is what's coming, and you're filling that space until you get to this big change or whatever is going to happen. And that's just part of it. It's part of being a team player for the publisher. And you can have, I mean, I have had many discussions with editors. I've had some editors that I've had knockdown, drag out fights with over story elements. And it's all because we all want to tell the best story. But when you're at Marvel and DC, you can have those arguments, but they're going to have final say. You can convince them sometime, maybe it's something that you're passionate about and you can sell them on certain ideas. But at the end, if they say, no, this is what it's going to be, then that's what it's going to be. Mm-hmm. With a creator-owned book, on the other hand, I have final say. It's an editor might have suggestions. They might have things they want to talk about or story elements that they think we should go in a different route or handled in a certain way. But it's my call. It's the creator's call on those books. Because like I said, they're creator owned. So those are my toys, and I can do whatever I want to with them. And then there's a difference in terms of fandom too. Fandom, people who it's interesting. And I'm not bashing fans in any way because, like we've already said, I'm a fan, but fans are much less forgiving of their Marvel and DC characters. They don't like necessarily some of the ideas you might tackle, and they have a lot of ideas of where it should go. So I noticed that when I started out, I was doing all creator owned, and the feedback was almost completely positive. So I thought, wow, this is great. Now when I'm writing, some X-Men characters or Superman or Batman, I'm going to get that positive feedback. And that was not the case, so that, some of the pushback on on the fan side of things, was a little shocking. It was a little bit of a learning curve for me. But it's fine. It is what it is. But that was one of the things that I think is a big difference. I think fans are, and you want fans to be invested in these characters. But man, they can get really invested. They can get really invested in the characters.
Well, I think comic book fans and Star Wars fans are particularly the most vehement. And,
oh yeah.
And I think you worked on Star Wars with Darth Maul, so maybe you had to experience part of that. But I think you can't cater to everyone's preconceived notions. You have to tell your own story.
No, yeah, you can't, because if you try, any writer who tries to write for what people are their interpretations of the characters, that's madness. I mean, you can't do it, because there's so many different different factions, I guess, out there that believe different things, and you just can't do it. So you've got to tell the story that you think is the best, and some people are gonna like it, and some people aren't. And that's, both of them they have valid opinions. I mean, I may not agree with those opinions, but they're valid opinions. And that's fine. Years ago, I was at a convention. It was right after I started writing Venom, and I walked into this giant panel room. It might have been, I think it was in San Diego, but I'm not. It might have been like a New York Comic-Con or Chicago. But anyway, this one of those giant panel rooms, and Ryan Stegman was talking to this guy up by the panel. He was dressed as Venom, and Ryan says, "Cullen, come here. This guy wants to tell you how much he hates you." And he was a giant guy. I was like, "All right, let's hear it." And he was a super nice guy. He just didn't like some of the things I was doing with Venom, and we talked about it. And I've heard from him in recent months even. I'm fine with people disagreeing. I remember one of my wife's favorite convention experiences. I was writing Lobo for DC, and the Lobo I was writing was the new 52 DC Lobo, who's, I call him sparkly or sexy Lobo because he's sleek and he's good looking and he's charming. He's not the main man.
Right.
And I was at a convention in Tennessee, and I left the table for a little while. And on the way back to the table, some guy some other creator that I didn't know says, Hey, Lobo's looking for you. And I was like, all right, that's fine. And I get back to my table and I look down, and here comes this dude dressed as main man Lobo. I mean, he was, biker, big biker, dreadlocks, chains, cigar. Here he comes. And I was like, here he comes. And my wife was with me at the table. And he comes up and he says, I got something I need to talk to you about. And he reaches into his back pocket, and he had the first issue of my Lobo all crumpled up and like rolled into a roll. And he's like, I got a problem with this. And he slams it down on the table. And we talked for a while. I mean, in the end, his opinions are valid. He doesn't like sparkly Lobo, and I can't. What am I supposed to tell him? I mean, but he ended up buying some 6-guns from me, and he was a fan of 6-gun from that day forward. So that guy's never going to like sparkly Lobo, and that's fine. It's okay. I like main man Lobo as much as I like the Lobo I wrote. So
every book isn't for every person. That's why we have such a great selection of comics that are.
Yeah, we're lucky that there are so many comics out there.
Yeah.
Do you have a particular Marvel book or DC book that you've worked on that you're the most proud of, or the one that you really look back on as like, that's the one I feel the most passionate about?
There are a few. I mean, Magneto we mentioned. I really, I'm really proud of that book. I thought it was a great book from beginning to end. Even when we had to get involved in like was Axis and Secret Wars and everything like that. Those things came in, but I feel like I was able to tell the story I wanted to tell. Sinestro, which I was working on at the same time as Magneto, I feel like that was a great book from beginning to end. Mm-hmm. And I was proud of what I did with Sinestro. Uncanny X-Men. I feel like, in a way, Magneto, Uncanny X-Men, and X-Men Blue were really one big long storyline, because I just kind of was able to use characters that I use elements from other stories that I wanted to continue with. But Uncanny X-Men is a big deal for me, and I'm proud that I got to work on it because as a kid, my dad and I collected Uncanny X-Men together. My dad wasn't a comic reader, but he loved going to conventions and he loved building collections. And we built a collection of, X-Men from #1 down to whatever was current when we stopped collecting. So it meant a lot to me that I was writing that character or those characters. I did, by the way, sell that collection. I'm trying to reacquire it now. I'm 12 issues away from my X-Men run. Wow. But so that was important. And I'm not saying it was a perfect book but it's a book that I was proud of. I was proud that I got to work on it. And I did a book called Fearless Defenders for Marvel, which again was not a book that was perfect. It had a lot of flaws, but it was an all-female team that I pitched. I was just looking at my original pitch for that series right before I got on this call. But it was an all-female team, and people. The thing that I really love about that book is it's been several years since it came out, and I still get people who come up to me, and that book meant something to them. It was important to them for various reasons. Not very many people read that book, but those who did, those who read it loved it, and it meant something to them more than just being a comic that they had fun with. And for that reason, that book means a lot to me still.
I would love to talk about the twisted and amazing world of Bone Parish.
Oh, yes.
We reviewed this several months ago. We
What's
loved
that?
it. So we reviewed this several months ago.
Yeah. Just the whole concept, everything else in it seems like I can see how somebody came up with it. The concept, though, of snorting dead people's ashes and the ashes of poets and getting their experience, and how it becomes the new drug on the street in New Orleans, and there's the house that controls it, and then the people from New York and the cartel want it. And I thought that was I loved Bone Parish because it was so out there of a concept. I'm like, how in the world does somebody think that? And of course it just spoke to me. I was like, I totally would probably do this drug.
Bone Parish has a long development period, because when I first came up with that book or that concept, it looked nothing like the book that came out. It was actually, if I were to dig up the original pitches that I was putting together for Bone Parish, I never sent them out, but things, my developmental documents, my brainstorming documents, Bone Parish started out as much more of a superhero book. It had more of an element of people using the ashes of like ancient samurais and ninjas, and they were gaining these, almost superhuman powers and going out. And it probably had more in common with Big Trouble in Little China than it did the book that eventually came out, which was much more of a grounded, supernatural crime story about a family. And it was one of those things. I had those initial concepts, and I thought there was something there, but it was never ready. And it just went through numerous, in my head, every few weeks I would go back to it, and I would, start coming up with different ideas and massaging that concept until I got it to a point where I was like, oh, that's the story I really want to tell. And I took that out to Boom, and they liked it. But it was, it took years for it to get to the for it to get to the point where it was this story of a family that was getting in over their heads in the drug trade. It was much more. It was not ready for the public when I first started coming up with those ideas. There was something there. This idea of snorting the ashes of the dead. That's sort of the hook. But it wasn't enough of the hook itself isn't enough. You have to have characters that people like, and a story that people can connect with and understand. And a lot of my stuff, that's the way it works. The Six Gun was the same way. I had a completely different concept for the Six Gun when I first started toying with that idea, and it eventually turned into something that was right. But yeah, I love that book too. Bone Parish is for me, it's one of the books that I think best represents me as a writer, along with Six Gun, along with Harrow County. Bone Parish is it's a shorter story. It was always only meant to be 12 issues.
Do you think you'll ever return to that world, or do you think you finished and closed the door on it?
Maybe. I'm open to returning to that world, and we left it. There's potential to return to the world of Bone Parish, but I think it's just I think it's a solid maybe. I don't know that there's nothing in the works right now for it in terms of me writing a new series, but I left it open enough that I could. I obviously I have story ideas for what I would do with it, but there's nothing formal in the works.
And I'm really hoping for a hardcover and omnibus down the line, because that I love that series. I'd love to have it in a hardcover format.
Yeah. I would love to see that in a nice hardcover edition for sure.
Do you have any other upcoming creator-owned books or books you're working on right now that you can tell us about? Or are they too far down the pipeline to really discuss at this point?
I have several creator-owned books with a few different publishers that were deep in the I was deep into. And then of course the apocalypse happens and everything kind of goes is pausing. But I don't know that any of them have been announced yet, unfortunately. But I have a few new creator-owned books with Dark Horse in the works, some new books with Boom in the works, some new books with publishers I've never worked with before that are in the works. Since the quarantine and the lockdown, I've sold a couple of new concepts to other publishers, so I've got some new stuff with Aftershock on the horizon. But I don't know when they're going to come out at this point. There's a lot of questions about when that'll happen. Brian Hurt and I are working on a couple of new things together. Some for publishers and some that we're probably going to do something a little more creative with in terms of how we're going to get it out there to the readers. But we're not ready to announce that either. So yeah, a few new books. I've got a couple of things with Valiant that aren't creator owned, but I'm doing Shadow Man for Valiant, and that book would have come out, but it's been delayed now until we know what the landscape's going to look like.
You are one prolific writer. I will say that. I had it in my mind that I said I should do a review or a spotlight on Cullen Bunn. Let me collect all my Cullen Bunn books. And it was like up to my neck. And I was like, how am I going to do this? He's written so many things for so many people. It's unbelievable.
Yeah. It's all out of desperation. I know this is all going to go away one day. The comic book business is very mercurial, so I know it's all going to vanish at some point for me. So I'm just trying to do all the stories I want to do before that day dawns. But yeah, and I like to stay busy. I don't enjoy doing nothing. And I make a point. I write down at least a couple of new ideas for books every day.
Wow.
Some of those they don't amount to anything, but sometimes, and I've even done as much as I say, okay, for this hour, I'm just going to come up with new concepts for books. And I just start writing for an hour. It's almost like free writing. And I'll come up with 3 or 4 different ideas. 80 to 90% of them is those ideas are terrible, but sometimes kernels of something bubble up that can turn into something down the line.
What does a normal day look like for you in terms of writing? Like, how many hours are you putting in? Like, what's your schedule? Because again, to be so prolific, you have to be working a decent amount of time every single day.
Yeah, I put in it. I work. If we're saying, without conventions or anything like that entering into the mix to throw everything off, I usually come down to my office at about 8 every morning, and I work till about 6.
Wow.
And I work. I sit. I pace a lot. I might change where I'm sitting. I might sit on that couch back there. I might sit here. I might go to the bar down the street and sit and do some thinking. But I typically work from 8 to 6 every day, and I work on the most weekends, at least a few hours a day on every weekend day. And when I say that, I mean there are times where today I'm going to go see a movie. And I'll go see a movie for a few hours, but I make that time up somewhere down the somewhere during that week, I make that time up. So yeah, it's more than a 40-hour-a-week job. But at the same time, I'm writing stories for comics. It's difficult to complain about that too much.
Well, especially being a creator-owned, writing creator-owned comics, it's almost like you have small businesses to operate all over the place.
Yeah, and and when I say that I'm working from during that time, some of that's not writing. Some of it's trying to get market those books. Some of it's pitching new projects. Some of it's responding to fans, doing interviews. All that stuff enters into the equation. It's all part of it. So I can't say that I'm definitely not nonstop writing during that time, but I try to get as much writing in as I can.
It's a remarkable amount of output that you have, quality output too. It's not like
some of it.
No, a lot of it. I happen to be a huge fan. I was very excited when Taylor told me that you agreed to do the interview. Yeah, I am a huge fan of a lot of your stuff, so that's why it's so impressive that so much of your stuff is good. Taylor, do we have the home version of this show to give to our guest? I mean, what do we have any final questions for
him? So we do some lightning round questions for our creators at the end.
Okay.
Before we get to that, I have one final question before we get to the lightning round is, do you have any news about any TV or movie adaptations of your work? I'm sure you probably get tired of answering that question, but I'm sure people would like to hear what you have to say.
I have no real news that I could share. I mean, there's definitely several things in the works. Some things that I think announcements will be made relatively soon, but I don't know. The only things that I think have definitely been announced is there's the movie based on The Empty Man that is coming out sometime this year. It was originally slated for an, I think, August release in theaters, but I'm not sure if that's still the case anymore. I mean, everything's changing. And The Unsound is in development for a feature film on Netflix. And then there's several others, and like I said, there's some are further along than others. So I think there will be some announcements in the near-ish future on some of those things.
Yeah, there's not much point talking about it until they're actually filming, because you never know with movies and TV shows.
Well, yeah, you don't. And even filming, you never know. I mean, I've always said I'll believe it when the credits, or when I'm in the theater or watching it on TV and there are the credits.
Well, I'll move to our wrap-up lightning round questions. You're obviously known as a horror guy. You've written a lot of horror comics. What are some of your favorite horror movies that you would recommend to our fans?
Well, my number one position, it's always shifting. It's either going to be The Thing or Alien. I like it goes back and forth which one of those two I think is my favorite horror movie. There's a lot of great movies out there right now that are classified as horror. I think if you haven't seen the movie Tigers Are Not Afraid, you are depriving yourself in a major way. It's on Shudder right now, but it is an absolutely breathtaking movie that you should rush out to watch right away.
I know about Tiger King. I never heard about that movie.
No, it is as opposite of Tiger King as it could possibly be. But it's a great movie. Like I said, it's streaming on Shudder right now, and I even think Shudder may be doing like a free month, so you could probably go get the free month to join Shudder and check that out. But that's there's a lot of horror movies I love, and a lot of recent stuff that I've really enjoyed. And there's a lot of cool stuff on streaming, that you can see. I like The Void. If you haven't seen The Void, it's kind of a Lovecraftian, John Carpenter-esque horror movie that's kind of fun. But I'm telling you, that Tigers Are Not Afraid is something special.
Okay,
Definitely
good.
check that out.
It's great to know.
And I love to listen to jazz while I read comics, and Jess loves listening to ambient music. Do you listen to music while you work, or do you have to work in silence?
I usually work in silence. I do have a lot of soundtracks and stuff like that queued up that I can listen to sometimes, but almost every time I forget. You know, I just forget to turn on music, and it doesn't. I don't necessarily miss it, so I don't rush out to do it. If I do listen to music, I have to. I don't usually like things that have lyrics. It's too distracting for me while I'm working.
Yeah, same for me. Whenever I'm reading or doing anything.
Yeah, but yeah, I used to listen to a lot of soundtrack stuff, and I have a big, like, you know, when CDs were a thing. You know, I have a big CD collection of soundtracks that I've slowly moved over to my computer and stuff, but I just forget to do it a lot of times.
So what are some of your favorite comics being published right now that you think our viewers should check out?
I think most of them are going to have read these, but you know, Black Hammer is awesome, and you should absolutely be reading Black Hammer. I like Sea of Stars by Jason Aaron and Dennis Hopeless. I think it's a great book. I just read, and it hasn't come out yet, I just read Devil's Highway, which is coming out from AWA. It's by Benjamin Percy and Brent Schoovener, and it's sort of a noir story set in along the the rural highways. That's going to be really great. I don't know what the release date of that is now, but I got to read a preview of it just a few days ago.
Awesome. Well, that's all the questions I have for you. Where can our viewers find you online, on social media?
So you can always visit my website, which is just cullenbunn.com. On social media, Twitter's the best place to reach out and find me, and it's just my name, @Cullen Bunn. That's I'm probably most active on Twitter these days.
And you also have a YouTube, right?
Yeah, I do a YouTube show with Dennis Hopeless and Kyle Strom called Missouri Swagger, where I don't know what we talk about, just nonsense. It's just it's just us talking about comics and movies and the things that influence us. I think we're talking about board games this week, so we try to pick topics that we're going to stick to, but then we always derail very quickly, and it ends up being Dennis Hopeless talking about how good his hair looks, and Kyle and me talking about what junk food we're eating, and that kind of stuff.
Perfect. It sounds perfect. Okay, well, this has been great. I really cannot tell you how much I appreciate your taking the time to talk to us.
Well, thanks for having me.
Yeah, you are one of my favorite writers, and it's really been an honor to have you on. Those of you out there that want to follow, you heard where to follow Cullen Bunn. If you want to follow me, OmniDog, I'm on OmniDog's Vault on YouTube and OmniDog's_Vault on Instagram. And Taylor is the guy who reminds me of what shows I have coming up and what I'm supposed to be reading on those shows because I have a terrible memory.
I am your external memory.
Yes, he's my hard drive, so I appreciate it.
You're the guy in the chair.
Pretty much. He calls me a slave driver, but that sounds better.
Yeah.
So thanks again, and to our audience, thank you for watching, and peace and love. Peace and love.
See you guys.